In today's episode, we sit down with one of the top experts and professors on Chinese foreign policy and strategy. We're also going to be joined by a friend of mine who's going to be joining us for our discussion and interview today. Let us begin. Patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman. We've got a special episode today. We've got two guests joining us for this episode talking about Chinese grand strategy in the 21st century. I've got my first guest, who is Dr. William Norris from the Bush School of Government Public Service. Dr. Norris is an associate professor at the Bush School, where he directs the Chinese Studies concentration and teaches graduate-level courses in Chinese politics and East Asian security. His research interests include East Asian security, business-government relations, Chinese foreign policy, and international relations theory, specifically the use of economic statecraft. He is the author of Chinese Economic Statecraft, Commercial Actors, Grand Strategy, and State Control. He has been the recipient of numerous fellowships and research positions with the Woodrow Wilson School and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, among others. I also have a friend today who will be joining us, Ben Zimmer. Ben is a former classmate of mine and holds a Master of International Affairs degree from the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University, where he studied Chinese politics and intelligence. His research interests include authoritarian politics, nuclear proliferation, and East Asian security with a focus on the Korean Peninsula. His writings have appeared online and in print with Charged Affairs, the Journal of Sino-American Affairs, the Peninsula Report, and the Houston Chronicle, among others. Currently, he has a manuscript under review with the Security Challenges Journal and is working on projects examining Chinese nuclear proliferation and North Korean foreign policy from 2016 to 2019, as well as applying to doctoral programs to further his studies. Dr. Norris, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Sherman. It's my pleasure to be here.
And Ben, I want to welcome you onto the show as well.
Thanks, Sherman. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Fantastic. Well, let's get right into the first topic here. We were talking before this episode about the formation of what we now know as the PRC, but we have to go back a bit further into time. I want to start off with the Cultural Revolution, which happened in the 60s. Dr. Norris, could you start us off by explaining the Cultural Revolution and how it impacted China as a rising power and a power that engaged with more international partners?
Sure. So I think the Cultural Revolution is it's a very complicated period in Chinese history. So I'll do my best to kind of tease out the important strands of that as it relates to our topics for today. I'll start by saying that the most important effect that the Cultural Revolution has is to really set the stage for Deng Xiaoping's opening up a reform period where he's going to really put China on a very different track from a grand strategy perspective. And that's made possible by the ideological disillusionment that happens as a result of the Cultural Revolution. So let me unpack kind of what the Cultural Revolution was, what it was about, and why it happened, and what that means for where China is today. So initially, I think to understand the origins of the Cultural Revolution, you have to understand a little bit about Mao and his career trajectory. So following the disaster of the Great Leap Forward, Mao's position within the party changes, and he basically spends some time out in the wilderness, in the political wilderness, if you will. And he's watching the evolution and the development of the People's Republic of China in the 1963-64 period, 65. And he's thinking that the direction of the revolution that he led to establish the People's Republic of China was beginning to stall out, and it was becoming bureaucratized. It was becoming overly static from Mao's perspective. So he wants to make a comeback and stir the pot and to rekindle and revitalize the revolutionary spirit, particularly among the youth in China. And that's going to lead to his eventual decision to kick off the Cultural Revolution. That's going to begin in arguably 1966, and that's going to then extend for a period of almost a decade of tumult in China and leading to a lot of chaos and the loss of life. But without getting into all the details of the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, suffice it to say that it was a very chaotic period in Chinese history, and it was a period that was highly ideological. It was motivated by ideas and interpretations of Maoist thought in particular, and different factions and variations and interpretations of that thinking. And after the Cultural Revolution winds up, the Chinese polity and the Chinese people are really quite exhausted and quite disillusioned with the notion of an ideologically motivated revolutionary fervor. And that allows and sort of creates the political space for the rise of Deng Xiaoping to eventually lead China down this path of opening up and reform, which is going to set the stage for China's engagement in global politics. Not that they weren't engaged previously, but it really changes the tenor of their engagement. And perhaps more importantly, the economic reforms that unleash the economic growth that China is going to experience starting from those late 1970s through the 1980s and into the 1990s. And then once they join the WTO in 2001, it's really going to take off. And that leads us to the China of today, which is the world's second largest economy. So that's just kind of a quick sort of setting the table, the auditory buffet for your listeners, as it were.
Wow. I mean, I remember reading about the Cultural Revolution, and when you look at just how big of an upheaval that was, and I think even now, looking back about 60 years after that tumultuous decade, I think the 60s in general was a tumultuous decade, no matter where you go, it seems like. But you really see so many of those remnants of the 60s. And I guess in the United States, we might think that it was kind of a while back in terms of the decades. But when it comes to Chinese history, it seems like that was such a recent event. And I think understanding the impact of that Cultural Revolution is really vital to our studies. I want to pose the same question to Dr. Norris again, and then I'll ask Ben the same question. Given the contemporary circumstances, do you believe that the Cultural Revolution was inevitable?
It's an interesting question, Sherman. I'm not sure that things in history are ever fully inevitable. I think you can look and see the various forces that lead to a certain historical event or certain pattern of events that you observe in history. But I think it's most historians, and I'm not trained as a historian, but some of my best friends are historians. Most historians are going to tell you that history is highly contingent and that there's a lot of serendipity, there's a lot of idiosyncrasy in terms of why things happen. So I guess I would say that no, I don't think the Cultural Revolution was inevitable. I think that it was a consequence of a lot of different forces happening in China, particularly in the political side. And I think primary among those is the force of Mao. And the second one, which we haven't had a chance to talk about yet, but I think is looming large, particularly in the second portion of the Cultural Revolution, which is the question of succession. So who will come after Mao to lead China? And I think that's another important driver in understanding the why behind a lot of the dynamics we see in the Cultural Revolution.
That's a really great answer. Thank you so much, Dr. Norris. Ben, I'm going to turn it over to you. Do you think that the Cultural Revolution was a bit of an inevitable time of Chinese history?
Yeah, I think Dr. Norris is right. I don't think anything was inevitable, but I do think seeing Mao as he was made it. He basically wanted to do something, and I wanted to ask Dr. Norris a question because I think this pertains a lot to Chinese grand strategy in general. But you talk a lot in class, Dr. Norris, on like the insecurity in Chinese leadership and everything that emanates from that. So do you think that Mao's comeback and the Cultural Revolution was, on some levels, Mao's insecurity that his thought was being revised basically in a way he didn't like it. And it was kind of his way to cement his ideals within the political upper echelons in China.
Yeah, it's a good question, Ben. I think he's clearly dissatisfied with the direction he thinks the revolution is taking under Liu Shaoqi in particular. And the thing that he doesn't like is this notion of bureaucratization or the stagnation that he sees beginning to creep into what he views as a revolutionary state, or what ought to be a revolutionary state, according to Mao. And so I don't know that I would say that it's necessarily insecurity on his part, but there's definite concern that he has over the direction of politics that the direction China's headed in politics. And I think towards the end of his life, he's certainly um, very conscious of and concerned over the future of the project of the People's Republic of China. That there's a revolution that took place, that he had a mission to revitalize China, to make it great, and he had a vision for how to go about doing that that was primarily predicated on mass mobilization and the dedication of the Chinese population towards harnessing that energy and channeling it towards this mission of restoration and restorative greatness, which he viewed through the lens of Maoist communist thinking. So in terms of the insecurity, I guess there's some insecurity around the notion of the legacy and where it's headed, but I think it was more a sense of discontent and a sense of the necessity of agitation, that there was a lost generation of youth that were coming up in the PRC of 1965, let's say, who had missed out on the important experience of revolution. And I think Mao wanted to offer them that experience in the form of the Cultural Revolution. And I think undoubtedly it was quite chaotic. And I think analytically, I would say that a lot of that ultimately is sort of driven by this notion of succession within the system, and maybe some discontent with the overall direction that he saw China heading in his absence, in this sort of state of semi-retirement that he's in right before the Cultural Revolution begins, before he swims back across the Yangtze River and makes his triumphant return to the political stage.
First of all, that was a really good question, Ben. I really appreciate that. Dr. Norris, as you know, and as we all know, the Soviet Union was the major power besides the United States at the time, and there was some talk about this Sino-Soviet split. Could you tell us about how that plays into our understanding of Chinese politics at the time?
Yeah, I mean, that's another important moving part of what's going on in sort of global politics during this time, particularly after this 1969 set of confrontations between the Soviet Union and the PRC near the border on the Ussuri River. There's actual fighting that breaks out, and I think Mao is quite concerned in the run up to that, and then subsequently about the potential for a real potential nuclear attack, or a pretty serious full scale military confrontation with the Soviet Union. And in some ways, I think that's what creates that opening that Kissinger sees, or helps to create, is that notion that there is this rift between the Soviet Union and the PRC, the two leading powers of the communist bloc, as the United States saw it at that time. So I think there's a lot of reasons to go into why that took place, what drove the Sino-Soviet split. For our purposes, I think the important thing to understand and recognize is that there was a series of areas where their views began to diverge quite starkly by the time you get to the late 1960s. So, but it doesn't start then. It really begins arguably not long after Sputnik. So probably in the 1958, 1959 timeframe, there's already a sense of friction and discord, and arguably, even from the very beginning, when Mao initially is successful with the revolution and he goes to visit Stalin in Moscow, and there's even from the very beginning, there's a sense of mistreatment or disrespect that Mao feels at the hands of the Russian Soviets, and that sits awkwardly, I think, in the Sino-Soviet relationship. But then it's one of the factors that leads to that open split by the time you get to the early 1960s. Although interestingly, I don't know how perceptive the United States was about that division within the Soviet or the communist camp, because during the 1950s, when the United States is very focused on the rising threat of communism in the world, we tended to view communism as a fairly monolithic threat, largely orchestrated from Moscow. And I think that towards the end of the 1960s, that was one of the reasons why potentially it actually we had to see fighting break out between the two of them to kind of really get the sense that, wow, there could be very different views of what they want to be doing in the world and who's going to be in charge of this communist movement. So there's Tom Christensen has a really good book on this notion of whether or not Soviet or the communist threat is a monolithic threat, and whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing in terms of U.S. interests and U.S. foreign policy, whether or not that's a divided threat or not. So I'd encourage folks, if they're interested in learning more about some of these ideas and these theories, to check out some of his work. And there's just great scholarship in general now during this of this period of the Cold War, since there were some archives that were made available, and that's allowed us to have a little more clarity into what was actually potentially going on, that eventually would result in Nixon and Kissinger's visit to Beijing and the ultimate opening up of U.S.-China relations that's going to happen by the time you get to 1979.
When many people think of Nixon, we think of Watergate, we think of the Vietnam War and the eventual end of the draft. But one of the landmark aspects of the Nixon administration was Nixon's visit to China, really starting a new era of the U.S. and China engaging or competing against each other for now years to come, all the way to the present day and into the future. So my question to you is, were there any dissenters or major arguments against restarting and engaging with China, especially in an anti-communist environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sherman. And actually, it's kind of interesting to look back on this history. Nixon and Kissinger go to China initially, and they have these initially secret meetings, and then they announce to the world that we're going to open up and we're going to connect up with China and establish relations. But the relations don't actually get established for a little less than a decade later. And so it's an interesting question, like what takes so long? And it's worth unpacking a little bit what's behind that. Part of it is the issue of Taiwan. So what's the status going to be with U.S.-Taiwan relations subsequent to this reestablishment of relations with the PRC? Because before we recognized the PRC, of course, we recognized the Republic of China, which was located on Taiwan. And that was the entity that occupied the UN seat reserved for China on the Security Council. And so one of the big sticking points in the diplomatic dance that would eventually result in recognition of the PRC, but not until 1979, was this issue of Taiwan and the status of Taiwan. And that's going to be done largely through a presidential administration, not necessarily through a whole of government approach. And so Congress feels like they were not properly consulted on this diplomatic maneuver. And so Congress is then going to pass the Taiwan Relations Act, which continues to govern U.S.-Taiwan relations. It's a domestic act of Congress, a domestic U.S. law that's passed by Congress, largely in response to what Congress views as an executive branch move to establish relations directly with the PRC and by extension to disestablish relations with the ROC, the Republic of China, located in Taiwan. So that's one of the issues. The other one, of course, on the Chinese side of the equation is the death of Mao. So Mao is going to die in 1976, and that's then going to create some turmoil on their side, and it's not going to be feasible for them to try to move forward on the rapprochement or the reestablishment of relations with the United States until Deng has largely solidified his position as the next leader of China. And so on both counts, both on the Chinese side and on the U.S. side and in the relationship itself, we also have on the U.S. side, you've got the Watergate scandal that hits Nixon. And so there's a series of reasons that both on the Chinese side and the U.S. side, and then in the relationship itself, that lead to maybe a rather unexpected length of time between the initial opening of relations, or try the outreach to kind of establish the outreach to establish a relationship with the PRC, and the actual formal diplomatic establishment of that relationship. And so that's just something kind of interesting, I think.
Ben, I want to turn it over to you now. I know we're using hindsight here, but do you have anything to add onto what Dr. Norris just said?
Hindsight's always fun to play with. I still think it would have been fairly, depending on the circles you run in, I think it would have been fairly difficult. But I think if we saw the Sino-Soviet split in the fighting, and we were pretty, at least the administrations from my read, were pretty intent on using China to drive a wedge in that communist bloc and try to balance it against the Soviet Union. So I think it would have gone forward either way. I think with hindsight involved, you could voice them a little easier, those concerns that Dr. Norris was talking about. And I think you could also, some people would probably also argue that China's playing a bigger role in the Asian communist movement than the Soviet Union. And so how does that factor into it? But I think there was a lot of geostrategic concerns and a lot of grand strategy concerns outside of our relationship with China that played into it. That would have made it, in my opinion, would have made it very difficult for those concerns to be voiced. And I think even past, I still think we would have done basically the same thing.
Now let's move on to Deng Xiaoping. Deng is a really interesting guy in terms of the study of how China went from Mao China to a bit more of the modern China that we recognize as an economic power, certainly rising power over the last several decades. What impact did Deng Xiaoping have on China?
Sure. So I'll start by saying Ezra Vogel has done a really masterful biography of Deng that I would encourage people that are interested to take a look at it. Don't be intimidated by its thumb factor. It's hundreds of pages. I think it's just a little shy of 1,000 pages. But he's a great writer, and it's such a fascinating story, the biography of Deng and what his career, what his life looks like. For our purposes, we'll pick up his story in 1978 at the third plenum of the 12th Central Committee. This is where he gives a speech that essentially now we look at and we say this is the beginning of the opening up and reform era in Chinese history, in Chinese modern history. And this is basically what Deng does is to say we want to develop China economically, and we're not too particular from an ideological perspective about how that happens. So it's a very pragmatic turn in Chinese political economics, where Deng essentially gives the green light to entrepreneurs, to grassroots capitalism. Really, he doesn't call it that. It's socialism with Chinese characteristics, or it eventually will become socialism with Chinese characteristics. But it's effectively a decentralized allowing of market liberalization to happen in China's economy that has a profound impact on China's overall economic growth, its well-being, its productivity. And that's going to start in December of 1978, and it's going to continue with fits and starts all the way right up until Tiananmen in 1989. And then there's going to be sort of this sort of pause on the reform effort as the hardliners consolidate after Tiananmen, and the liberals and the reformers are in the doghouse, in the political doghouse, if you will. But there is this opening up and reform era that gets kicked off by Deng, and he doesn't himself have a crystal ball that says this is where we're going to go. This is going to be the way that we're going to develop. He has some inclinations. He has some ideas. He looks to Japan's successful efforts in the 1970s as a primary source of inspiration and says, this is an export-led growth model. China ought to try to do some similar kind of export-led growth. And that's eventually going to create these special economic zones along the coast that are going to become areas that attract foreign direct investment and begin to produce for export and international markets. And that's eventually going to create an impetus to want to integrate China better into the international global economic system, which will culminate, I think, in the 2001 entry of China into the WTO. So that whole glide path, I think there's a vague sense of kind of that he wants to go towards economic development, but he has a phrase that says China wants to cross the river while feeling the stones. In other words, we don't exactly know where we're going. We know we want to go across the river, but every single step of the way, we're going to have to kind of reach out. And it's a great image if you imagine yourself standing on the banks of a river and you want to put one foot in and you see the rock right there and you kind of dip your toe in and you, okay, yep, that rock's there. It's not too slippery. Okay. Now bring the other foot over. Let's look for the next rock. Okay, there's the next rock. Let's hop onto that one. And so it's really this notion of a incremental, gradualist, and very pragmatic path towards opening up and reform, where China was going to sort of find its way as it moved forward. And Deng's mechanism for doing this was essentially to go around and visit successful businesses or locations or township village enterprises or provincial governments, and to give his imprimatur to efforts that had taken place. And by giving him, essentially by giving his seal of approval after the fact, he signaled to the rest of the system in China what was permissible, what was to be encouraged, what was permitted, what was allowed. And that was how he controlled or directed that opening up and reform. And this is the history of this is really kind of a fascinating one. It's sort of two steps forward, one step back as you would begin to get problems with inflation. And so the economy would overheat. And so they had to kind of scale back some of the liberalizing efforts. And then the economy would stall again. And so then they started to relax and reopening it. So in Chinese, it's feng shui. So it's this notion of opening and loosening and then tightening and squeezing back in of the hand that retightens the level of government direction or control over the overall economic activities.
What I really like about that answer, I think, is that it solves a bit of the question of, did China already know where it was going? Because just like almost any experiment, you're going to have to try things. Some things are going to work, some things are not. However, I think it's justifiable for people to say that the way China has really changed, especially as that economic power, that political power, is really stunning. And I think anyone who looks at the history of China in recent decades will tell you that it is unprecedented. And I think, relatively speaking, we might not have ever seen that. I don't think we might have ever expected that, perhaps. Certainly, at least from the 1970s perspective into the recent years. I'd say that even in recent years, we might have been a bit surprised in terms of what China is still doing right now all over the world.
Yeah, and Sherman, just on that point, it kind of brings us back to the point I made earlier about the role of the Cultural Revolution in all this, because there was this mass disillusionment with ideology in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. It really allowed Deng to be freed from the ideological fetters that made certain kinds of economic activity out of bounds previously in China. And so that's, I think, the important, interesting insight is he was then set free to pursue a very pragmatic course without undue regard, let's say, for the ideological implications of that. Now, of course, being a communist country, he always had to kind of think about it in how is he going to reconcile what was actually working and happening on the ground with the ideological components of the party and how that was going to shape or impact the overall interpretation and positioning of those activities. And this is something that happens right up to today. In 2020, this is still something that the party needs to reconcile with itself and how it positions its various preferred policies on the economic front, because there's still this need to kind of come to grips with how does what's happening and what's succeeding in the regular marketplace, how does that reconcile with these ideals or this ideological dimension of it? And so I think that's just another place to kind of highlight that the Cultural Revolution really freed Deng from being overly constrained and limited in what would have been possible.
As we proceed a bit into the 90s aspect now of this history of Chinese grand strategy, One of the things I was picking up earlier was that there was a report from the House Intelligence Committee detailing what the findings were from the committee with regards to the intelligence community's ability to detect and collect and analyze Chinese intelligence. And the report really, I think, struck a very harsh tone on what has gone wrong on U.S. foreign policy. And its main conclusion was that with the fall of the Soviet Union, with the response to 9/11, and kind of that focus on counterterrorism measures, we were really behind on our vigilance in terms of this rise of China. And this leads to my next question to you, Ben, which is, what impact do you think these major events that I've just outlined, the fall of the Soviet Union, 9/11, war on terror, etc., had on our ability to detect and to mitigate some of these rising powers, I guess, especially on China's rise as an economic power in not just East Asia, but across the world?
That's a really good question. I'll try to do my best to do it justice, but I think it's a big factor that helped us miss some of the signals, because I think we were so happy that the Soviet Union fell. It's, as Francis Fukuyama said, it's the end of history and all the fun hoopla that came with it. And China was still developing. Dr. Norris can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at this point China's rise was not. It was rising. It was becoming more economically important in the system, but it still wasn't that. It wasn't as important as the Soviet Union was, or anywhere near what it is today. So I think in our hoopla of the Soviet Union falling, we've won the Cold War. We missed Deng Xiaoping's his changes and how it really impacted the system because we simply weren't focused on it. And I think that's played a big factor in how China's become what it is today. And I do want to pose a question to Dr. Norris, if that's okay too.
Sure, go ahead.
So one thing that you mentioned, Dr. Norris, is that it put Deng Xiaoping's reforms put China on a path where it's more or less dependent on what happens in the international economy. And so I was wondering what your thoughts on that were. If Deng Xiaoping, like early on, if that really did put him in touch with the foreign economy and with shocks, ups and downs, and if that really impacted China's economy as Deng was doing reform and opening. And also, I think Aaron Friedberg had a really interesting article on Deng's impact on China's grand strategy. And he basically, one of his arguments is that his changes helped co-opt the citizens by letting them enjoy the fruits of their labor and basically using that to buy loyalty to the party versus really trying to make a difference in the citizens' lives for the citizens themselves. And I wanted to know what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, I think that certainly Deng recognizes that the general Chinese population is disillusioned at the end of the Cultural Revolution, just to get back to that same theme that we've talked about a couple of times today so far. And so one of Deng's political insights is to provide a reorientation around the welfare and the well-being of Chinese citizenry, and to reposition the party as to provide that legitimacy that they wanted to be able to provide, that welfare, those benefits to the Chinese people. I think that was motivating a lot of his pragmatism. He was saying, we're sort of done with the ideological dimension. Instead, let's deliver the goods. Let's make people's lives better. And this is not going to be a position that's unfamiliar to most politicians in Western liberal democracies. Your success at the polls is often determined by your track record. Like, do you deliver the economic the goods during your time in office, or in charge of your city as a mayor, or in charge of your state as a governor? And a lot of times voters, for better or worse, whether that's right or wrong, and the voters will tend to ascribe economic success or failure to the senior political leaders in office at that time. And so I think Deng sort of recognizes, or it has an awakening around those dimensions of it, and says, well, now we want to be in a position where we are going to be providing those kinds of economic benefits to our citizens. And that will, by implication, I think this is where Dr. Friedberg's point is sort of taking off, that by implication, then the citizens will remain loyal to the party and will remain loyal to tolerating the party's continued governance of China. This becomes, I think, even more acute in the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. But certainly, even as you get into going into Tiananmen, there's already pressure that's building in the system for political reforms. And Deng is not as keen on the political reforms. He's interested in delivering the economic goods, but as is exhibited by the decisions that are made at Tiananmen, that there is a post Tiananmen, there's a desire to separate economic reforms and political reforms. And I would suggest that since Tiananmen, political reforms are off the table. They're no longer something that is in the mainstream of Chinese opening up and reform, but economic reforms will get restarted. But interestingly, they don't start right away. It takes Deng's southern tour in 1992 to begin to finally solidify the notion that reforms, at least in the economic sphere, will continue going forward in China. And Deng's rationale there is China cannot afford not to continue to open up and liberalize its economy if it's intending to grow and to succeed and to, again, restore its rightful position in international affairs as a great power. And so that's going to get restarted after the 1992 Southern Tour. But I would say to Sherman's earlier question about how inevitable was the Cultural Revolution, I think nothing about the opening up and reform was inevitable either. I think every step of the way, the wheels could have come off the cart, and so I think it's very contingent and it's very idiosyncratic to the decisions that were made at the time and by the Chinese leadership to kind of put them on that glide path. So I think that's my sense of sort of Deng and how he positions China's grand strategy. I think he viewed his job as making China economically successful in a way that up until that point it had not been. The PRC had not been very successful economically, and so I think he essentially took the position that said, I don't really have to decide what we're going to do when we become a great power again. My job is to get us to get to be a great power, and that's what leads him to the strategy of sort of biding one's time and hiding one's capabilities, is how it's often translated. There's some discussion about whether or not that's the right translation of Taguang Yanghui, but it's essentially this notion of keep a low profile in international affairs, even as China seeks to integrate into the international economic system. And that becomes even more important after the Soviet Union's breakup in 1991, because China does not want the same thing to happen to China. And this is only 2 years after Tiananmen, when they sort of had their own brush with these popular movements like the Arab Spring or the popular protests that end up bringing down the Berlin Wall. So Tiananmen happens in June of 1989. The Berlin Wall is going to come down in, I think, November, December 1989. And so I think that's the state of the world at that time in the late 80s and early 90s. There is this certain triumphalism in liberal ideology, and China wants to make sure that they're not on the wrong side of history in that direction.
I think one of the greatest lessons you learn from foreign policy is that understanding that vigilance is really key. I mean, we can have our priorities, we can focus on particular regions as threats evolve, and I think that's a big pillar of foreign policy, decent foreign policy. But I think the vigilance part really lacked in the 90s. And I think to Ben's point earlier, there really is no doubt that we did not have our eyes on the ball. And should that have been a priority? Again, in hindsight, it's difficult to say, but we definitely should have taken some measures and recognized that, hey, hold on here. we do have a rising power here, something to really look into. But alas, we didn't have those kinds of mechanisms, those kinds of thinking really to pay attention to that, especially as Dr. Norris mentioned, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed. Now let's move on to a couple more leaders now. Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. These two leaders coincide with some major events, including the Hong Kong handover in 1997, China's entry into the WTO, and others. Dr. Norris, walk us through these two leaders and how they transformed China into the power we know today.
Sure. I think this period is sort of the heart of the rising Chinese grand strategy. This grand strategy that had as its primary objective to secure a successful rise of China into a position as being a great power certainly on the regional stage, and then ideally maybe aspirationally on the global stage. And I think that that's going to be solidified during this period, the period that you lay out under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. China needs to complete its efforts to succeed economically. And the way that it's going to do this is under Jiang Zemin to kind of put China on the glide path to WTO accession, to become embedded into the international economic order in a way that, and there's some really interesting scholarship that's emerged recently on the domestic political calculations that were going on in China around WTO accession. And the dominant finding there, or the interpretation currently, is that that there was a desire to kind of lock in China's reforms, a desire to not have backsliding and to not let China undo the liberalizing that it had done. And there's sort of more bureaucratic micro-political calculations that underpin this in terms of winners and losers of globalization and integration into the global economic system. But for the most part, on the grand strategy scale of things, China's interested in securing its position institutionally into the international global economic order during this period in the 1990s and then into the 2000s. And then making sure that the region first, and then secondly, the rest of the world, isn't overly disturbed by the arrival of modern, powerful China. And so there's this strategy to reassure friends and neighbors nearby, and then also to become a responsible stakeholder, to be able to, Zellick's phrase that he puts forward almost as a challenge to China. But I think there's a desire to kind of reassure the system that the rising Chinese power is not necessarily something that needs to be opposed or feared or essentially seen in an unconstructive way. And so that's the kind of the two sides of this strategy. And Avery Goldstein, I think, still has the best book out on this period, where it's called Rising to the Challenge, and it's about China's rising power grand strategy. And I think it's a great book for not only the empirics of what China does and why it does what it does and the logic there, but I think it's a great book for students and non-students alike to kind of read for how he goes about thinking about grand strategy. And he's got a very I think a very elegant methodological approach to understand and articulate grand strategy and what a grand strategy is and how nations go about crafting those kinds of things and implementing them. And then I think he does a nice job covering rising China's grand strategy. Now, I'll suggest that this grand strategy shifts with the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And this is not necessarily the commonly held opinion in America's China watching community, although it seems to be picking up steam more recently in the last couple of years. But from my perspective, given what I study, which is primarily the economic dimensions of China's grand strategy, I detected a distinct break in China's strategic logic that takes place around the financial crisis. And the logic goes something like this. Up until now, China's been focused on a rising power grand strategy. It wants to secure the economic benefits of integration into the international economic order. But by the time you get to the financial crisis and the G2 notion, this idea that it's basically the United States and China, those are the two big economies that need to coordinate a response to the financial crisis, and the European economy as well, and the Japanese economy. But increasingly, it's seen that China is it has to be integrated into any kind of coordinated response. At the same time that you're seeing those movements at the international level, domestically in China, you're getting the culmination of a debate or discussion about whether or not China should commercialize its banking system. And with the clear political, in terms of the political interpretation in China, the clear failure of the Western banking model that was seen to have deregulated to the extreme, to the point that the banking system carried systemic risks that jeopardized the health of the overall economy and potentially the world economic system. Um, those political players domestically in China that wanted to see a slowing down or even cessation of Chinese liberalization of their banking and commercialization of the banking sector found a political voice that said, look, isn't it great that we didn't go too fast down this path, because we could have ended up like the United States, and had all of these mortgage-backed securities melting down on our balance sheets. And so that created a different domestic political discussion in China that very quickly turned into, well, if the rest of the world needs China so badly, why are we still walking on eggshells? Isn't it time that China begins to be given the kind of respect and deference that our position implies as the world's second largest economy, which is going to happen when they surpass Japan in the aftermath of the financial crisis? This narrative is going to pick up steam. And by the time you get into the early teens, the early 20 teens, I would suggest you begin to have a different sense of China's grand strategy, in my opinion. I think China is increasingly seeing itself as a great power. It may not be totally finished yet with its economic success. It may not be exactly where it wants to be, but it's, for the most part, something's different after the financial crisis. And the sense of what's different is that China has, to some extent, arrived in a way that previously it was still a rising power. And I think after the financial crisis, China begins to think of itself as a risen power. And now what? Now what do we do? And that's been this process of grand strategic revisiting. What does that look like, and what should the rest of the region, and then extension, the rest of the world, do in response to China's new position in international affairs? And I think that's kind of where we are today in terms of Chinese grand strategy. And I would suggest that it's fundamentally different than China's rising power grand strategy. But again, that's not necessarily the majority opinion in the American China watching community today.
Really interesting. That is really interesting, Dr. Norris. I think when we look at these different strategies kind of built on top of each other, it kind of makes you better understand a bit of more of the dynamics that are going on in China at different time periods under different leaders. I really think that that's so helpful for us. Before we break and end this first part of this episode, Ben, did you want to add anything or ask a question before we wrap it up for this first half of our conversation and interview today?
Yeah, so this is actually the area I'm not as familiar with, unfortunately, as I should be. But I think one thing that Dr. Norris said that really struck with me is that China's ascension, especially into the WTO and into the world economy and those institutions, was a way for it to basically lock in Deng Xiaoping's reforms and prevent backsliding. Because you do see a lot when authoritarian regimes try to open up and try to do it. You do see a lot of backsliding going on, especially in the early stages of it. But I did want to ask Dr. Norris if you could elaborate a little bit. So there's one view that Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao were basically not the securers of Deng's legacy, but the bearers of Deng's legacy and his leadership. And I wonder how do you think that played into their grand strategy and how they viewed China in the world, and if they're kind of going on a counterfactual, if there wasn't a Deng opening and reform, do you think China still would have risen to the point it is today, or do you think it would have just kind of muddled along like most regimes do that don't liberalize their economy to some extent?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ben. And counterfactuals are always very difficult to engage in any rigorous way. What would happen if China hadn't opened up in '78, or if Deng hadn't decided to pursue that? As you're familiar with, there's the North Korean economy, which in the 1960s was arguably doing quite well, but it really began to hit its limits in terms of the kind of growth and the kind of economic success that it was able to enjoy. And once it begins to top out, if there's no reform or if there's no effort to revitalize economic activity, then countries can they could simply stagnate. And I think this has been a challenge for Shinzo Abe in Japan with the Japanese lost decade, and the idea that he was coming in with an explicit effort to try to kickstart the Japanese economy and try to get it going again because it had stagnated. It's not unique to China, this notion that economic growth, and the United States has gone through periods where the economic performance is maybe not as robust as it is at other times. So it's not unique to China, but had Deng not gone in that opening and reform direction, I suppose that he could have tried to reestablish a more bureaucratized, organized, state-planned economy. And I might suggest that it may not have been as productive as the loosened entrepreneurial economy that he ended up presiding over. And I do think that you're right to think that Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao viewed themselves as the inheritors of that momentum, at least on the economic side. Now, each of them, of course, has their own peccadillos and proclivities and their own uh, interpretations of where they wanted to go with China's grand strategy. But by and large, I think that was consistent with this notion of a rising power grand strategy. And again, I think Avery's book makes a pretty compelling argument and clearly lays out the logic of what that rising power grand strategy is. And it's quite straightforward. It's quite simple. It says keep everything pretty peaceful on the international front because war is bad for business. Allow China to integrate into a relatively liberal international economic order, uh, and reap the benefits, the productivity gains that come from deeper integration into global value chains and welcoming of foreign direct investment into China and welcoming of foreign managerial expertise in terms of human capital infusions, and leverage China's relatively large, relatively inexpensive labor pool to compete effectively in the international realm. I think it's a pretty straightforward logic. It makes quite a bit of sense. I think that it's consistent. I think you see Jiang Zemin making an effort to repair relations with the United States, particularly after the 1995-96 Taiwan Straits crisis. But it's a two-way street. I think the United States also recognizes the benefits of a prosperous China and integrating more deeply with the Chinese economy. And so I think that's something that you see happening in the late 1990s, and that's going to eventually move China away from the annual most favored nation debate in Congress, where essentially every year Congress would get to hold China over the barrel and hold them to account and take them to task for whether or not they still deserved the status of most favored nation, which is most favored nation status is when you agreed to bestow upon a counterparty or a trading partner the same treatment that you're going to give to whoever you have the best terms of trade with in a particular sector or in a particular issue area. And so it's a way of encouraging free trade and globalization. And in the early 1990s, that was something that Congress would have to ratify every year on an annual basis. And so one of the important things was when Congress decided to grant China permanent most favored nation status, which was a prerequisite before it could be allowed or considered for membership in the WTO. And then once China was in the WTO, then it gets the benefits of all of that liberalization of tariffs and lowering of tariffs and trade barriers, and then integration into the global economic system, which then fuels China's rise as a great power, because it is predicated on, and throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, on this export-oriented growth model. So I think that you're right, Ben, to maybe characterize Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao as stewards of that grand strategy, of that rising power grand strategy.
I think looking at these leaders' records in China and seeing how each leader played his part in building China as that great power, I think is really, really important to our policymakers and government officials today. I just want to add one thing before we wrap up our first part, and that is that when we look at these strategies, especially from an American perspective, maybe it is reasonable to assume that in contemporary times, it might be difficult to always wonder, should it be more engagement or should it be more pushback on certain issues? And that continues to be a question today with various administrations. I think there's no doubt that there are areas of cooperation, even amongst different administrations. But I think the extent of that cooperation, especially given the politics of the United States and given what has happened with this rise to power of China, these are really difficult questions, I think, to think about. And I don't think it's reasonable to assume that it was just such an easy decision maybe to just go one way or the other. My take is that we should have been a lot more vigilant. We should have taken more action. We should have been a lot more forceful in terms of our positions, our democratic values and our positions on foreign policy. I think we should have been a lot tougher. And on that note, I want to thank Dr. Norris and Ben for a great first part. This is kind of halftime for our episode. Make sure you tune in to part 2, and we'll continue our conversation from there. We'll pick it up again soon.